Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Before we get started in a few minutes, we would like to share a few housekeeping rules. Please keep yourself muted as well as your video off to ensure we're not taking up bandwidth. The session will be recorded and we will share the recording tomorrow, and the full links to the report will be available immediately after. Lastly, there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A function that appears at the bottom of the screen. We will hear from CAF America President and CEO Ted Hart and Senior Vice President of External Affairs Jesse Kraft. Just a little bit of background on our speakers. An internationally recognized speaker, Ted has over 30 years of experience in advising global philanthropy and is an expert in regulatory frameworks governing both domestic and global philanthropy and risk management. Jesse has been with CAF America for almost 10 years and is responsible for developing and executing services assisting donors with strategic grant making, philanthropy planning, and investing charitable assets. A little bit of information about our host organization. Since 1992, CAF America, the Charities Aid Foundation of America, is the leader in cross-border giving. CAF America is known for its commitment to regulatory compliance, risk management, and reputation protection. Now I'll pass this over to Ted to get us started.
Thank you, and thank you again for joining us today. Today, CAF America shares Volume 4 in our series of reports on philanthropy during this global pandemic. Today, we share with you the voice of corporate philanthropy in response to COVID-19 worldwide report. On behalf of all of us here at CAF America, I wish to thank everyone who participated in this survey, and in particular, two of our friends who stepped forward to support this report and to ensure that we have a very diverse spectrum of corporate philanthropic voices participating in this survey. With the help of CyberGrants and the Association of Corporate Citizenship Professionals, ACCP, today we are sharing with you an important window into the corporate boardrooms and strategy sessions that led to important creativity, compassion, and philanthropic efforts here in the United States and around the world that have been instrumental to the improvements seen in many communities that struggled early during this pandemic, with lessons learned that continue to help those who are hard hit today here in the United States, in Brazil, India, South Africa, Russia, Mexico, Chile, the United Kingdom, and so many other areas that, as we see confirmed cases, have now surpassed 15 million people, with total deaths having eclipsed 625,000 people. Before we get started, please stop whatever you are doing and think where you were 4 months ago. 4 months ago, nearly to the day. Because I can tell you what was happening at CAF America. It was March 19th, 2020, 4 months ago, nearly to the day, that we made our first COVID-19 global pandemic-related international grant. It was to the Italian Red Cross. The grant had been advised by PepsiCo in the amount of $200,000. This grant was made on the very day that Italy had the sad distinction of having overtaken China as the country with the most deaths from COVID-19 at that time. Since the earliest days of this global pandemic, CAF America has been collecting data and making it available to philanthropists who want to make a difference. For months, we have surveyed over 1,700 global charitable organizations, and this has allowed us to tell the story of unfolding trends amid the disruption and uncertainty of this pandemic. We've learned how nonprofits are working hard to keep their doors open, trying to keep their staff members safe, while still providing life-saving and life-changing services. Along the way, we've had the privilege to be a part of some amazing stories of critical philanthropic support around the world. Many of these stories involved corporate philanthropy. Time and time again, corporate philanthropy was proving to be a critical value to inform the global response. This new report highlights how nimble corporate America has been, how they have significantly increased giving both domestically and internationally. Furthermore, this report highlights the growing flexibility in the approach corporate America is taking to giving. American corporations are listening, and it's making a difference. Corporations planned ahead, so they knew the initial crisis would require long-term support, and so they planned. American corporations have proven to be steady partners for charities in their time of need. American corporations are redirecting their philanthropic support so charitable organizations can meet challenging needs of their communities, changing needs that cannot always be seen on an Excel spreadsheet, that can always be measured by the human heart. Let's go to the next slide. We wanted to give you a bit of a sense of just how diverse and how wide the cross-section of corporations in the private sector are that have participated in this survey. And we're quite proud of the cross-section of both large and small corporations that participated, and we thank all of those who stepped forward to be part of this survey. Jesse Kraft is joining me, and we want to share with you, first of all, and welcome, Jesse. What's really striking to me is the diversity of the Sustainable Development Goals that are funded, given that COVID-19 is a health issue. Are we seeing this variety of funding areas generally in CAF America's COVID-19 work in the United States? And what are some of the examples of things that corporate partners are supporting? And as we go to the next slide, we'll see the domestic giving coverage for all 50 states and Puerto Rico. Jesse?
Yeah, thanks, Ted. Yeah, as the pandemic is really affecting all parts of our society in different ways, it's great that we are really seeing a diversity in funding to different issue areas. I think this is a really impressive graphic that shows. I think that should show bring some comfort to the charitable sector to some extent, which we know is also suffering its own challenges during this time. But I think it's a light, perhaps, to see that there is still a lot of diversity in funding that's happening. It's not all being funneled towards health and things like that are more directly related to the pandemic, because of course this is affecting all different parts of our society. We're seeing, we're of course seeing corporations provide funding towards vaccine research and immunotherapy clinics at hospitals or other institutions. And we're seeing some charities respond. For example, we're seeing some cancer research institutes that are diverting some of their resources, labs and scientists to COVID-19 research, which is great, of course, for the overall push towards more efficient vaccine research, but it is also, in some of these instances, setting back some of the important research that's happening already in these medical fields. And then I think within this, we're also domestically seeing a lot of programs that focus on financial health and sustainability of individuals and families, which highlight the fact that corporations are focusing on the very direct reality of the global pandemic, the need to provide PPE and medical equipment, as well as in some more of the indirect effects, such as the economic and social impacts that COVID-19 has caused.
And of course, Jesse, with so many people in the United States out of work, to see corporations stepping forward to help with things like financial literacy, financial stability, and of course, a lot of effort being put into employee financial relief.
Absolutely.
Let's go to the next slide. We want to also share what we've been able to learn specifically on international support. And Jesse, corporate America is stepping forward. Nearly 60% of the surveyed corporations are giving internationally. But what's really impressive here, and of course this is a global pandemic, the funding is spanning 93 countries, Jesse.
Yeah, it's truly amazing. And we've certainly seen similarly wide geographic coverage from our own work and our own corporate clients that matches this survey. And what's interesting is while the SDG funding here is still fairly diverse in cross-border giving over the past 3 months, there are, you see some more clear trend lines in international work going towards health, disaster relief, education, and food security, which are all areas that are very clearly impacted directly or indirectly by the pandemic. One thing that's been striking with the work that we've been doing with corporations and their COVID-19 response is the desire to reach all of their employees and markets in some way, even in regions that they might not generally have philanthropic activities or which might present more difficult challenges. We've been involved in a lot of conversations with corporate partners about the type of work they want to support and where. And what it's really made me proud, so proud of the CAF America team for you know, 'cause we hear so many stories that are coming from our corporate partners, and the team here has just some amazing creative solutions that we've come up with along the way to help our partners achieve their goals. I think one interesting trend that we've seen during this crisis is an increase in working with for-profit entities that are trying to use their resources and connections to undertake charitable efforts on the ground in local contexts. And of course, you know, talking about making a charitable grant to a for-profit entity is a challenging space to navigate always when you're making grants from the United States, but it is possible under expenditure responsibility if you do it right. Of course, regulation, you always have to stick to the regulation no matter the challenge. But I think a really cool example of this is when one of our corporate partners wanted to find a way to provide free meals to strained healthcare workers quickly earlier on in the pandemic. And we partnered with a local food delivery company to leverage their technology and their structure to provide these free meals. So they did it at zero profit, totally free of cost to the health workers. And this type of arrangement is normally a challenge for our team as it requires additional levels of scrutiny and vigilance, but even more complex when you have to get it done in really tight timelines. So just really impressive work that we're seeing coming from our team, but also the creativity coming from the corporate sector.
Yeah, and this, as you started off, you mentioned that, you know, granting to 93 countries, of course, is you know, an everyday occurrence at CAF America, as we actually fund over 110 countries on a regular basis, but in such a concentrated period of time. And for many of our corporate clients, what we have seen and is more companies coming to us and reaching out to countries that perhaps they've not funded before.
Yes, definitely. So it's been really interesting to see them spread their philanthropic resources to places that they don't normally go.
Yeah. You also mentioned the challenge to our staff of looking at the issues of current grants being reissued, and we're going to get into that a little bit further on in terms of how corporations are being more creative and more flexible. We're going to go to the next slide, Jesse, because this is where we really, the American corporations digging deeper. Seeing the great need here. They're doing more to support in this time of need. During the past 3 months, first 3 months of the global pandemic, about 72% of the corporations responding to our survey increased their corporations to charities, and 20% maintained their philanthropic budgets. This is, of course, at the same time that all of these corporations are dealing with the exact same global pandemic. So, you know, one of the things that you know we're very mindful of is that oftentimes, and it's the work of CAF America, that we're often dealing with adversity where we're working with corporations who are trying to make a difference. You know, it comes to mind most recently the Australian bushfires, where we have a lot of corporations who are giving to support those, but they're in the United States giving to bushfires that are in Australia. But Jesse, in this instance, we're talking to corporations who they themselves and their employees are dealing with the same global pandemic, the same virus, that they are reaching out to other communities around the world to help those communities as well. This is a whole different picture.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can all attest to the fact that this is certainly a unique experience that we are experiencing together as a human race, for sure. But yeah, I mean, you know, this is hugely impressive to see the growth in giving, to your point, given that we are all ourselves suffering through this crisis, but still working to help as many people as we can. And this number really, you know, helps me kind of understand where my last 4 months went and where the entire staff of CAF America's last 4 months went. And thinking back, you know, I remember when we first realized that this was not only going to be a global crisis, but that the response from our donors was also going to be significant. I was actually on vacation in mid-March, and at this point, the urgent donor requests just started pouring in, and our team was doing everything they could to keep up. I actually canceled my vacation time and started diving into this response work. And then the week I got back, I actually fell very ill myself. And so to your point, it's something that we are all going through and experiencing together as we're trying to help others.
Yeah,
But
and Jesse, that I don't want to lose that point, because of course we were all very concerned about your health at the same time that lots of requests were coming into CAF America, and of course you pushed forward as we were all trying to support you and trying to support our donors at the same time. Let's go to the next slide, because a lot of what you were dealing with, our staff was dealing with, our corporate clients and others we're dealing with, is sort of on this page, right? So we see the 3 months in graphic form here, where in a very granular way we're seeing where corporations are growing at very high level, a smaller number were decreasing. But as at the beginning of this webinar, I shared that for CAF America, we can go back and we know that for us that started with that PepsiCo grant to the Italian Red Cross on March 19th. Of course, the work started before that. That's when we actually made the grant. But when did you and your staff know that this growth was in the pipeline, when we saw that this was something that was starting to look like this graph?
yeah, I would say it was around that same week, the week of March 19th, was when we really started feeling the pressure and feeling the increase. And yeah, I mean, we truly at CAF America, we lived these numbers. So all this growth that you're seeing here, it's affirming to see all this data come together in the survey to understand where this last 4 months actually went. And at the same time, we're seeing these huge increases in donor support. So again, like the 3rd week of March, the charities themselves were also becoming very stressed, feeling that they might be missing opportunities and windows for funding as the impending economic effects were becoming more clear. So we were getting all of these inquiries from donors, and then our charity partners at the same time started asking us questions and about funding opportunities, sharing their COVID-19 related work, because they were all shifting their programs toward COVID-19 and wanted us to be aware, because they know we have many donor connections. And that's the time when our COVID-19 response page was born, which now has the names and descriptions of over 300 organizations in 56 countries that are responding to COVID-19, which we know from our corporate partners has been a hugely important resource to them in trying to determine where they wanted to give. So all this growth is happening, and we were feeling the pressure from both the donors and charities at the same time.
Yeah, and so the corporate donors want to be responsive, and they're of course hearing from charities that they've already funded who are starting to hear from their communities, and people are dying, and people are their communities are being affected. Let's go to the next slide, Jesse, because there's just so much to unpack on this slide in terms of what we learned in this survey in terms of the strategies. And again, this is what our staff lived and has been living, continues to live day in and day out. And this is really where, as I set up at the beginning of this webinar, the creativity, the caring, the thoughtfulness, the strategy of corporate America, working with CAF America, really came out in this survey in terms of how creative could we be, what were the strategies that could be deployed here. So what have been some of the most noteworthy strategy shifts that we've noticed with our corporate clients, that those that are reading this report, those who maybe are not CAF America clients, but want to learn from the strategies that because we're still in the middle of this global pandemic, and big parts of the world, all over this country, new peaks, new hot spots, almost every single day we're seeing the virus peaking again and again and again. So while we saw those peaks in other parts of the world, we're now seeing them here on our continent and on other continents. So these strategies have worked and continue to work. So help us learn what are the things that charities have benefited from that were born right from the earliest days of this pandemic.
Yeah, it's really great to see how much shifting there happened, because it was necessary, as I'm sure many of the corporates on this call can attest to. These shifts were absolutely necessary, and only 4% respondents said that they didn't have a shift in their strategies. But
which is really an amazing number in and of itself, and that so just about every single corporate philanthropist found the need to have some sort of change or shift of some sort. So again, I want you to walk us through that. But I think that 4% of no change is really remarkable in and of itself.
Definitely. Yeah. And I also, I want to walk through a couple of the shifts or highlight a couple of the important shifts that I'm pulling out of this data just based on our experience. But I think what's also interesting is that at the same time that this COVID relief has been ongoing and there have been these types of shifts, we've also seen a really important push from our corporate partners to maintain some of their normal grant cycles. So they might have shifts and kind of sideline programs that they're running, but they're also trying to maintain their normal cycles on the same schedule, or even in an advanced schedule, to kind of maintain the sustainability of these organizations and to kind of help relieve some of the stress that a lot of these organizations are having. Which I think is also really important, that some of the grant cycles that, long-term partners are expecting are still happening while we're having these shifts. But, one of the statistics I really like here in terms of the shifts themselves are that there's a lot of increased engagement with the local employees on the ground. I have so many stories of where this has come into play and has been enormously helpful for a number of reasons. But I think to Ted's point, one of the most important reasons for this is because the local contexts are so rapidly changing that it's so important to be tuned in with your local employees on the ground, because the needs are changing and the types of the areas that are shut down are changing and things like that. So it's important to keep in close contact with them and help us navigate those local contexts at the same time. In one instance, we were working with a charity in South Africa right after everything had been shut down, and we were holding a very large emergency relief grant for them. But they themselves, the charity, was not prepared for the shutdown and didn't have the equipment to work remotely, which meant that they couldn't complete our application requirements. So a local employee was actually able to connect with them locally and provide what they needed to help them submit the application, which meant that we were able to get the funds to them really quickly. So it's been great to see the resourcefulness and passion coming from the local employees through this crisis too. So it's great to see that many corporations have taken this route in terms of shifting. And another example that we've seen is we have one corporate partner that completely decentralized their decision making to put full control of philanthropic decisions into the hands of their local employees, again, because of the rapidly shifting context. So I'd say there's a lot to talk about in each of these different strategy shifts, but I'd say that for this group is the most impactful.
Mm-hmm. I think that, it's also interesting to see, in addition to, we talked earlier about the increase in funding, the increase in the number of grants that are being given. You had mentioned the broadening of the types of charities that are being funded, mm-hmm. and a desire to continue funding charities that they've traditionally funded, but also to expand beyond that. Can you talk about how those decisions are being made and how those conversations are being are undertaken? Because that sounds like that can cause a bit of a conflict to how do you make those decisions, right? You've got long-term relationships and you want to be true to those, but at the same time you have new needs right in front of you.
Yeah. And I think the answer to that is also related to this increased employee engagement. So, we're seeing corporations really listen to the needs of an employee or a group of employees in a certain area and their communities. And it might not fit in with some of the normal philanthropic strategy of that particular corporation. And so and that listening and engaging has caused them broaden their issue area focus to include whatever it is that that community might need most. So yeah, it's not always fitting in with some of their standards, and sometimes some of the corporate foundations have had to get board approval for some of these shifts. And so it kind of depends based on the corporation how they've managed it, but I think a lot of that has been driven by the knowledge coming from the local employees.
Right. Because I focus on, you know, just the how strong those two numbers are: provided immediate relief funding and provided regular project funding. Both of those numbers are very strong in the survey, and that looks to me that provided a lot of challenge to the folks that are on the ground providing that support.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's go to the next slide. The next slide really speaks to the issues of flexibility, and the vast majority of donors are offering flexibility, which is really, you know, one of the central themes of this report, which is really important as a support to charities. And we saw this mirrored, Jesse, in our first 3 reports as we were hearing this story coming back from charities themselves, and just how valuable this flexibility has been to charities. But there is a limit to how flexible you can be when you're working internationally. Can you talk to us a little bit about either how do you balance that, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so firstly, this question really points to why our donors rely on CAF America, because the regulations always matter. And I think during these times of crisis and emergency relief, you're getting a lot of pressure as someone working in the corporate philanthropic space. You're getting a lot of pressure from so many sides to make things happen quickly that, you know, we often hear, well, you know, can you just this once, just make this happen without this application? And, you know, when you're working internationally, that's really not possible because the regulations always matter. And that's our role, is to make sure that all of these grants are done, are made legally and safely. Because you certainly wouldn't want to find out down the road, for example, that you had funded a shell charity or something like that. You know, there's there's a lot of fraud happening during these times. So, you know, we are still protecting our donors, protecting CAF America by making sure our grants are still compliant. And you know, one corporation poignantly noted in the survey responses that there really is only so much flexibility you can offer. There's a lot you can do to be flexible, but there is a limit, particularly if you're working internationally. There's only so much you can do to modify the application and reporting requirements if you're working under expenditure responsibility or equivalency determination. And for example, you can't waive the reporting requirement under ER, but you can allow we can allow for program timeline extensions, or you can update grant agreements or things like that to give the grantees more space to complete the project and provide an accurate report. So there are ways you can still be flexible within those limits, so long as you're still following those rules.
Let's talk specifically. Again, we have a lot of corporate philanthropic experts on the webinar today, and others that will listen afterwards. So let's talk some specifics here today. Changing grant purpose and remaining, which is something that we hear very loud and clear. I've received a grant. I have a very good relationship with the funder, which would be in this case CAF America, but there's an advisor, and obviously CAF America is working very close to the advisor of those funds. And now I'm facing a global pandemic, and I can't meet the terms of that original grant, and I have immediate needs that are in front of me. Can I just spend that money on what my immediate needs are? Or can I just decide to change the grant purpose, or or am I locked in for forever? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah. So if that question is coming from a grantee, you know, the first recommendation is always look back to your grant agreement, because you'll know very certainly what you need to do if you're not sure. If it's an expenditure responsibility grant agreement, that answer is definitely going to be no. and in terms of whether you can just totally change your project and your timelines without reaching out for approval first from that funder. In this case, in this scenario, CAF America. You know, they're under equivalency determination. You still need to look at your grant agreement because you might still have restrictions in that area depending on how that grant agreement is written. You know, so just always look back to that agreement in particular. But yeah, we've had some charities that have reached out to us 2 or 3 times already, changing their grant agreements. And you know, we're always, of course, very open to it, to reviewing that new purpose. Again, to your point, Ted, working with the advisor, so whichever corporate advisor, to make sure they're aware and in the loop. But of course, that ultimate decision making and agreement modification falls on CAF America. But yeah, this is also something that's been taking quite a bit of our time. Again, as a way to be flexible with our grantees, just to help them modify their commitments and their grant agreements following.
65% of those who participated in the survey have offered to change the grant purpose to redirect funds to the most immediate needs, and 54% have offered grant extensions. Should anyone feel obligated to do that I need to do that if the original grant is something that they feel was very, you know, needed in that community? Should any funder feel an obligation during global pandemic that I need to be flexible, or I should change my grant purpose?
I don't think you should feel obligated. I think it depends on the circumstance and the program itself. But you know, I think if you feel very confident or very certain that you want to fund that particular program, I think then what you could look to in order to help that grantee is to be then flexible on the timelines of it. Because in many of these cases, we have actually seen the grantee saying, well, yes, we do plan to do this project and we want to, we know it's important, this is part of our mission. However, we need 2 more months because we literally can't do it right now during the shutdown. Right. So yeah, so I think it's important to have those dialogues with the partners to determine the best route to take.
Now, salaries and rent and utilities and things like that are things that are often not included in some grants. We're seeing more of those operational everyday expenses being funded during this period. Why are we seeing that, and is that a trend that you see possibly going forward, being important for charities and for funders to consider?
Yeah, it is really important because, you know, and I would point you to our previous volumes 1 through 3 of this survey series that we've been doing, which have been, you know, polling the charities and helping us understand that, you know, this type of funding, this operational funding, is so important for the sustainability and resilience of these organizations. And I do think that this pandemic and the need for sustainability and operational funding is having a potentially long-term effect on the thought processes of corporate donors in terms of whether they want to support that type of initiative. We actually have one corporate partner that's completely shifting a large portion of their grant making in the long term, so not just for this year, to provide fully unrestricted grants toward operational funding needs through the use of equivalency determinations. Mm-hmm. We can also fund operational costs through expenditure responsibility, but what we do is we work with the organization to decide exactly what they need to put funds towards, and then we put it within a restricted expenditure responsibility grant agreement.
Again, as we have on earlier slides, I think it's noticeable and noteworthy that, you know, nearly 10% did not provide any flexibility. And I think that, again, that's a personal choice of each funder to determine, you know, where their funding is at and whether or not they feel that flexibility is warranted. While we're sharing our praise for those who are providing flexibility, and in many cases that is warranted, we're not suggesting that there's anything wrong with not providing flexibility if you feel that the original grants are grants that need to stand. Let's go to the next slide, because funders themselves, those that are working with corporations, there are challenges in making the grants, Jesse, and of course we feel that on a regular basis. Our staff members feel that on a regular basis. Let's talk through what some of the barriers are, some of the restrictions that are in place, some of the things that quite honestly is our day-to-day work in helping corporations, helping those that we advise work through these barriers and these problems. And in many cases, Jesse, things that we're used to dealing with on a regular basis without a global pandemic, in many cases have become even more difficult or more acute with a global pandemic.
Yeah. So, we've certainly had challenges. And in many instances, the barriers we've experienced have actually been temporary. For example, we saw in the beginning banks that were being closed for short periods or short periods of time where we, just could not get funding through, or charities taking some time to get their remote digital capacity up to speed, which, was also a barrier to the process. But certainly I think the biggest barrier, and we see this at the top of this mountain here, is the inability to complete projects because they just needed to be done in person or just based on the nature of the project itself. So this is a barrier that grantees themselves are facing. We did start to see some initial challenges where we are having difficulty in countries which already are challenging and require prior permissions or approval from the government to send foreign funds into the country. And in many cases, these government offices were actually closed, so we couldn't get through. Countries like China, Egypt, Pakistan, Bangladesh. But actually, Pakistan had a really interesting approach to this issue, which I hope that others might adopt moving forward or in similar circumstances, where basically they provided a blanket approval to foreign funding, approval for foreign funding to many organizations, which is actually still extended, I think, through September. So that really enabled us to get funds to Pakistan much more quickly than normal, given the easing of those restrictions, because the government knew that they just weren't able to manage that application process or the approval process as they normally were. So that was one barrier that was helpful, or one change that was helpful during this time.
And Jesse, CAF America itself sort of reorganized parts of our team and made changes so that we could provide expedited service and could be there to provide the kind of service to work around many of these challenges so that those who were trying to expedite giving would not experience as many of these challenges. Speak to some of the things that we did to try to help move through some of these challenges.
Yeah. And I love this story too, because, well, first of all, it's a way that we shifted, right? We are shifting along with our corporate partners. And CAF America is also shifting in a way that I know is actually going to affect us in the long term. One thing we did was create what we're calling our rapid response team, which is a team of trained professionals that are managing a portion of our due diligence work. So it was actually adding additional capacity and additional staff to just validate charities and go through that process more quickly. So even though our volumes have really, truly exploded during this period of time, we've been able to get our applications reviewed very quickly so that we can get funding to the ground where it's needed most.
And that really made a big difference, particularly for corporations that were looking to fund charities that they had never funded before in parts of the world that they had never funded before, being able to get those validations in place because there were communities in need. Those were, charities and grants that needed to be made, and having those slowed down by a validation process, really could have been very devastating.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been expediting a lot of those validations, which doesn't mean, again, that we're putting any less scrutiny on these organizations or any less, less regulatory compliance. But it means with the additional capacity and expertise that we've added to our team, we're still able to maintain those same levels of due diligence as we always do, but at a more rapid pace.
Jesse, we have a question that's just come in, and while we will take questions at the end, this question is particularly tied to where we are right now. So I'm going to ask this question now regarding the barriers to giving. Question, do you have recommendations for the best approaches to minimize the administrative burden on grantees for donors working to accommodate their needs?
Yeah. So, I think what's important during these times, because you're going to be asked to fund a lot of different creative scenarios, is to really think through your process and think about, you actually need from each of these grantees in order to make a legal grant to these organizations. So, there are some circumstances where you might not need, right, if you're collecting 3 years of financial data or something like that as a standard from your grantees, because it's good best practice to do so, to have a better understanding of their finances. Some of these, as this is an example, some of these organizations can't get into their offices to provide that to you. And if you're saying, well, no, we can't move forward without that, then you're going to hit a roadblock. So I think, but in a legal sense, in terms of what you actually legally need, and taking that risk-based approach to your work, maybe you only actually need 1 year of financials, and maybe they can provide that quickly. So I think that's an example of the type of thing you should be thinking through in your application process to help understand, whether there's a need versus a nice to have scenario happening in some of these applications, and some applications are quite long. And so we have other corporate donors that have done a lot of work to slim down their applications. Again, not removing anything that's legally required, but maybe removing some of the data that they typically ask for in their applications.
Thank you very much for that question, and please post other questions in the Q&A area, and we will get to your questions. Let's go to the next slide. Jesse, as we were putting together this survey, it occurred to us, obviously, that we're surveying professionals that we work with, and professionals in the field and again, our partners, CyberGrants and ACCP, sent this out to their members and clients and helped us make sure that we had a very diverse voice for this survey. So we didn't want to miss the opportunity to learn from professionals based on their knowledge of the philanthropic landscape and what they were seeing in during this global pandemic, how long charities they believe could persevere under the current conditions. And Jesse, this slide really tells a story here that really 89% of corporate respondents predict that some charities will be forced to close their doors within 12 months. We certainly already have charities that have contacted us and are in a position of returning grants because they are closing their doors. It is very difficult. That is a story that has been told very loud and clear in our first 3 surveys. Are any donors talking about ways that they can support charities that are getting close to dissolution, or that they can prevent, or are part of the story of that they're seeing and are certainly telling us about the resilience of charities?
Yeah. There are a few ways that we've seen and talked and discussed with some of our corporate partners. Of course, there is, I think the immediate reaction is to increase the funding and work with some of these organizations to combat this. But that's one extra grant from one donor is probably not going to move the needle that much. It's going to help, but if they're in a position where they're about to dissolve, that's probably not going to be the change there. But I think other things that have been interesting to see is, well, some of the survey respondents actually indicated that they're thinking about ways to support these charities. And one thing that they're doing, one of the respondents in particular, is encouraging corporate partners, or is encouraging their charity partners to think about partnerships locally with other organizations that have similar work. So one, if a few charities that are, perhaps a few different food banks that are local in a region and close together, working towards the same goal, if they're all individually suffering, but together they might join forces and be a stronger unit. That's something that we're seeing some corporate donors encourage or even apply for specific grants to support that type of merger. So I think that's a really creative solution that to encourage partnership amongst local charities that have similar missions, so they can each focus on their core strengths. Maybe one organization is stronger in a certain area and one in another. And if they join forces, maybe they don't have to completely close.
Yeah, and there are some groups that are actually coming together and hosting dialogues about whole groups of charities that maybe are not similar, but talking about efficiencies and effectiveness and things of that, conversations that might not have taken place except for the fact that these are extraordinary times where funding is that much harder to come by, and volunteers are harder to come by, and just the efficiencies of running and managing a nonprofit organization are not there for many charities. Let's go to the next slide, because Jesse, we also, again, surveying professionals, working with professionals, we wanted to learn from them what is their current capacity to give. We learned early on in the survey, and we shared that these professionals surged giving. Most gave more, but this pandemic is continuing. As we see here in the United States and other parts of the world, it is surging. Is there a second wave? Is there a third wave? There are peaks that are reported on a regular basis. And as of mid-July, 86% of the corporations surveyed continue to provide financial support. They haven't ended their support. And 53% have further funding to allocate to charitable organizations, with a third of those being able to provide support to pre-approved grants. So help us unpack this a little bit in terms of, for charities that are listening, but also peers that are learning from other peers, in terms of looking at the rest of the calendar year, looking at the future of funding here. We're looking now into the future. These are very thoughtful, planful corporations that knew that this was not going to end very quickly. They surged their giving, but they see the need for continued funding. We hear that certainly at CAF America on a regular basis. So what does the future of funding look like right now?
Yeah, so I think some of the corporate partners that we work with have been talking about, the different ways that they're trying to stretch their budgets, and I think part of that is just looking at this year, but some of them are anticipating more need in the next couple of years, because this crisis has at this point not an end in sight. A few ways that we've seen corporations work to kind of stretch their budgets is, some are exceeding their budgets with approval of their boards of directors, so perhaps dipping into some reserves or into some rainy day funds that they have. Another corporate respondent in the survey noted how they're restructuring their annual budget allocations to accommodate responsive giving to vulnerable communities. So they're looking ahead and completely restructuring those budgets to allocate, perhaps more towards disaster relief, or this concept of responsive giving, so that it's not tied up in some of their normal grant making programs.
So we're seeing lots of different kinds of strategies being deployed and put in place. But I think it's fair to say that we're seeing a lot of planning. We're in conversations with a lot of corporations that are looking to be very thoughtful in the way that they organize and manage the future of their funding.
Yeah. I think in some cases, corporations have shared that it's sort of too early to tell in terms of how this will affect their budgets in the long term, but they're thinking and planning around the different scenarios that they might face in the coming months and years.
That's a good transition to the next slide, Jesse, because we did ask that question of what is anticipated about the future for next year. And as you see here, many of the corporations, 2/3 in fact, anticipate maintaining current levels of giving or increasing their funding. And I think it's, you know, a small percentage, 1.4, are seeing a significant increase, but even a slight increase and remaining the same, I think, with current economic conditions, seeing, you know, 17% with a slight increase and 47% being able to remain the same with the economy and the condition that it's in. Only a quarter of those looking at decreasing their funding after such a large percentage surging this year. Jesse, this is probably, at least from my estimation, a rosier picture than I might have expected.
Yeah, I think so. I did expect to see more of a decrease, even though we're not feeling that right now.
Yeah, right.
The work we have is certainly on the rise still, but I was expecting, in terms of the future outlook, to have more gloomy figures in terms of the decreases here. But you know, when I look at this data, I think back to the charity surveys that we've been conducting, and in one of the statistics we collected, 440 organizations stated that they expected at least 20% decreases in funding over the next 12 months. And of course, that's not only from corporate sources, but here we're seeing that, you know, 25% of corporations expect some decrease during the next year. Fortunately, most of it's not significant decrease. So, you know, fortunately, we're seeing, you know, about 2/3 expecting to maintain or increase. So I think good.
Yeah, it's a strong view to the future, having you know, corporations really stepping up and doing so much to help and continuing in this year. I want to go to the next slide, Jesse, because we have, you know, rightfully been focused on the global pandemic as we look to the future of funding, but there's another topic that has come up and weighs heavily in the decisions and budgeting going forward. What else have we learned in this survey? There's a lot of other things that we've learned here about the strategy, but again, we have a lot of professionals that are listening today, and we want to unpack these last couple of slides that we have here today. But I think there's something significant that's also happening and is being a story that's being told and unfolded here during this global pandemic.
Yeah, in this survey and in some of the activities that we're also doing, we're seeing a really strong interest in funding racial justice and social equity programs. Many corporations noted in the survey the additional work and resources that they've been putting towards these initiatives during the past few months, and that not only in the past few months, but that this is a funding pillar that will likely be a long-term fixture and focus in their philanthropy. So, you know, much of that work has, of course, been domestically focused, but we're also starting to have conversations with corporations that are considering how they might expand these racial justice initiatives internationally, taking into consideration the varying local contexts and the specific challenges with racial injustices that occur in different regions, because of course that is very different around the world. And again, you know, this is where engaging your local employees will be extremely important to navigate, you know, how can you take your racial justice programs that have a very US focused lens and take that same funding pillar to the regions where you have employees around the world where they have similar but also different challenges in terms of racial justice and social equity programs.
Mm-hmm. Jesse, this slide is it's our next to our last slide here today, but you know, we have a lot of folks who are listening to the webinar here, peers learning from peers, and the focus here is strategy, future outlook, learning from peers about permanent changes to your annual grant making strategy. You know, these large bars here are, you know, pretty significant. First of all, you know, focusing on, you know, 31% said that they don't see any changes. So I think that that's significant to say about a third are sort of stay the course. But we've got some significant others here. You just mentioned racial equity and social justice lens coming into focus here, but there's more to unpack here that I think are important for our listeners and those who are looking to this survey. What else did we learn?
Yeah, and I think, going back to what you said in the last slide, the pandemic generally has been a time of reflection for corporate philanthropy and philanthropists in general, and what they're trying to accomplish. And this data really shows the results of that, where nearly 70% said that they think there will be permanent changes to their strategies based on the experiences right now. One of the changes that was noted by the survey respondents is a rethinking of employee engagement programs generally, because I think many employee engagement programs focus on volunteerism or in-person activities that have been totally canceled. And I think a lot of our corporate partners have been left scrambling to find alternative methods for engagement. So, you see 25% here saying that they're looking to expand or increase employee engagement programs, but I think also sort of a rethinking of what those look like. And that falls into the cancel or reduction of employee engagement programs, which is a smaller percentage too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But again, I think encouraging those who are listening and using this survey as sort of a barometer of this point in the pandemic, that there are a lot of topics, and as you said, a lot of things that are starting to come into focus, starting to enter into the dialogue. And I think we encourage that dialogue as a way to just start the discussions to see if these are meaningful to your corporation or not. Maybe they're already part of your funding approach or not. But I think just even putting them on the table for discussion is a good thing as we go forward. Jesse, I want to move on to our last slide here, and then we do want to be open for any additional questions that people have. Lots of resources that CAF America has been providing during this COVID-19 global pandemic. Resources for granting, continuing to extend the eligibility by 90 days for the charities that are eligible with CAF America, for those that need that eligibility extension. At our website, our COVID-19 response page is updated on a regular basis. We have the link here for you. As Jesse mentioned earlier, 332 eligible organizations in 56 countries. That's a searchable database that you can, corporations and other philanthropists can use to identify charities on the ground in 56 countries that are providing support in their communities. We have a series of webinars that and reports that we have already posted, and those are all available on our website. The reports are there for you to read. The webinars also have transcripts that are provided. Jesse and other staff members and I have also produced a series of podcasts on various topics related to the global pandemic and other topics specifically related to things of interest, including the CARES Act and important changes in the United States to changes in the IRS tax code related to the global pandemic. So you may want to listen to those and or download the transcripts and read those transcripts. We will continue to post content. Our next report, which will be volume 5, will be coming out in September. That will be a further survey, and we'll also be providing narrative reports on charities, documenting their progress through the global pandemic, from the beginning of the global pandemic, and starting to provide not only the voice of charities facing COVID-19, but putting a face to those charities. And we can wrap up the webinar, so we'll pass that back to the hosts. We've got one question here. I think our donors talking about ways that they can support charities that are nearing closure Jesse, I'll have you jump in on this one and we'll wrap up with this. How can this be prevented without just increasing funding? Talked a little bit about that, but do you want to share a few more things that funders and others are doing to help charities?
Yeah, you know, and I think there's value in having an overall strategy or thinking behind it, and you know, entering into partnerships with other local charities is one idea. But what I'd recommend here is really talk to those charities and talk about some of the challenges that they're having, and you know, where they feel like where they feel their biggest challenges. And I think you can learn a lot from that in terms of educating and informing your strategy around those partnerships. But yeah, I think the best advice would be seeing if those charities can partner with other local charities in hopes of surviving.
Yeah, I think efficiency and effectiveness is extremely important, and those are all very good strategies. So again, we're going to wrap up. For those who have joined us today, we thank you. This will be posted, and we've got the last slide here. Thank you for the ways to contact us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted and Jesse. As mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we will follow up shortly to share the recording of the webinar, and you can access the full report at cafamerica.org/COVID-19 report. Thank you so much for participating.